My name is Delaney Brooks. I'm 39 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and last week, I received an envelope so aggressively elegant it practically screamed, "You don't belong here." Thick cream cardstock, calligraphy handwriting, gold foil trim. It was a wedding invitation from my sister Charlotte. The fact that it arrived at my military base instead of my home address told me everything I needed to know. She didn't want to send it. Someone else did, probably Mom. Charlotte and I haven't been close since. Ever. She was the star. Harvard Law, high-profile litigation in Boston, dating the son of a sitting senator, and now marrying him in some vineyard that only rich people and wine bloggers seem to know about. I went the other way. West Point. Combat deployments. Cyber command. Sleeping in bunks narrower than a coffin while defending national infrastructure from people trying to crash it in the dark. We took different roads. Hers was paved. Mine had tripwires. Mom called 2 days after the invitation arrived. "Please go," she said. "Just for one day. Don't make this a thing." Right. Because it's never a thing until I show up. Somehow, I'm always the problem, never the sister who once told me I was just a uniform with opinions. Still, I said yes. Not for Charlotte. Not for appearances, but for Mom. She's not well. She hasn't been for a while. And part of me thought, maybe it would just be one day. One dress. One dinner. Then out. The wedding was in Vermont, at Somerset Estate, which sounded less like a wedding venue and more like the kind of estate with paintings of ancestors who owned people. The photos online showed manicured gardens, stone fountains, and chandeliers the size of aircraft parts. I booked a flight out of DC with a return the next morning. I didn't tell anyone at work where I was going. Not because it was a secret, but because it was just embarrassing. Try explaining to a room full of soldiers that you're flying north to sit through a weekend of being smiled at like someone's +1 who wandered in wearing a badge. I packed a black suit. No rank insignia, no ribbons. Just civilian. I've learned that people get weirdly respectful or instantly dismissive when you wear a uniform. There's no in-between. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a battlefield with cocktails. The night before I flew out, I sat on my bunk with the invitation in my lap. There was a line near the bottom I hadn't noticed before. "We're so excited to celebrate with family, old friends, and those who've chosen extraordinary paths." I don't know if that was meant for me. Probably not. Charlotte doesn't use words like extraordinary unless they're part of a press release. Still, I folded the invitation, tucked it in my wallet, and finished packing. I wasn't going to win anyone over. I wasn't there to be seen. Just to show up, smile, and leave before anyone remembered I came. Then again, showing up quietly has always been my specialty. If you've ever been the odd one in your family, comment. I'm not the only one who had to RSVP with gritted teeth. And while you're at it, subscribe if you like, your stories served with sarcasm and real-world consequences. The morning of the flight, I was up at 0500. Old habit. I didn't bother with breakfast. Just coffee strong enough to give lesser human palpitations and a bag with 2 changes of clothes. One for showing up. One for leaving. By the time the plane took off, I had already rehearsed how to introduce myself if anyone asked what I did. I work in cybersecurity. Sounds safer than I coordinate national defense strategies. Nobody wants to hear about cyber warfare between canapé trays. The flight was smooth. Too smooth, which felt like a setup. The car smelled like new leather and money I didn't make. The driver barely spoke, which I appreciated. I didn't need a whole Uber sermon about Vermont property taxes or the venue's beauty. I could see the beauty. It was all too much like people with a grudge against subtlety had built the place. Somerset Estate sat like a castle that got tired of Europe and moved to New England. Long gravel drive, iron gates, hedges trimmed like someone was getting paid by the angle. The kind of place where weddings aren't just events, they're power statements. A young woman in black approached the car as soon as it stopped. Her hair was perfectly bun, and her smile was professionally blank. "Miss Brooks?" she asked. We've been expecting you. Of course, you have. She led me through a courtyard that smelled like roses and cash. The entrance doors were 10 feet high, carved wood, probably imported from somewhere that lost a war. Inside, everything was cream and gold and silent. Rich people love silence. It makes them feel exclusive. A string quartet played something that sounded expensive and joyless. I followed my guide past clusters of guests who didn't look up. These weren't the kind of people who asked what you did for a living. They already assumed it wasn't important. We stopped at a check-in table manned by two women in matching navy dresses. One of them scanned a list and then handed me a name card. Delaney Brooks. Table 19. Table 19. That told me everything. You don't put your sister at table 19 unless you're trying to prove a point. There were only 20 tables, by the way. I wasn't just off to the side. I was practically in the coat room. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, took the card, and walked across the ballroom. The room was stunning in a way that made you slightly angry. Crystal chandeliers, floor-length ivory drapes, and floral arrangements are taller than most guests. A grand piano stood in the corner, auditioning for a perfume commercial. I passed the head table. Raised platform. Long white tablecloth. Name placards in calligraphy. Charlotte and her soon-to-be husband, Graham Sinclairis, that's his real name, are already seated, smiling and flawless. Her dress sparkled like it had its lighting crew. He looked like a political advertisement come to life. My parents were at that table, too. Of course, they were. My father has worn the same expression since the 80s, mild disdain mixed with stock options. My mother looked composed, polished, and distant. She caught my eye and gave me a quick smile. Not warm, just polite. I found table 19 tucked near the catering doors. Two people were already there. A second cousin I hadn't seen since high school and someone I assumed was their spouse or possibly their accountant. They both nodded, clearly unsure whether to speak. I sat down, placed my napkin in my lap, and resisted the urge to fold it into a middle finger. I had a clear view of the head table from my seat, but it was conveniently out of range for photos. Charlotte's voice carried as she laughed with a woman in a red dress. Her laugh hadn't changed, still sharp at the edges. The servers began pouring champagne. I declined. Nothing about this event made me want to be less alert. A string of formal introductions began. The pastor, the groom's father, someone from the Sinclair family who looked like he'd been cryogenically frozen in a yacht club. Each one made a toast. Polite applause. Sip, smile, repeat. Charlotte stood up. The room is hushed with the reverence you reserve for royalty or lawsuits. I didn't breathe. Not because I expected kindness, but because I'd learned over the years that someone would bleed when Charlotte had a microphone. I was wrong. This wasn't bleeding. It was surgical. Her voice didn't shake, but my grip on the water glass did. Charlotte stood with a practiced elegance that made you forget she had braces or once tried to forge Mom's signature to get out of gym class. She held her champagne like it was an accessory. Perfect posture, even better lighting. She smiled at the room like she owned the lease. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice crisp and clear and already 2 notches above sincere. "It means so much to Graham and me that you've traveled from near and far to witness this day." The crowd did that soft collective murmur rich people do when they want to signal they're listening without reacting. She nodded graciously. "We're surrounded by love, legacy, and excellence tonight. Family, friends, mentors, colleagues, people who've inspired us." I stared at the condensation sliding down my glass. The tablecloth under my fingers felt stiff, like someone with unresolved childhood trauma had starched it. "I've always believed," Charlotte continued, "that we're defined by the choices we make. The paths we choose. Some of us chose law, some chose public service, some chose leadership." I knew the beat before it landed. She was building. "And some," she said, tilting her head, locking eyes with me across the ballroom, "chose other kinds of uniforms." People chuckled. A polite ripple. Like she'd made a clever joke, not a public jab. Even my little sister made it here, she added, her smile widening. Our family's very own lowly soldier. Glad the barracks let you out. More laughter this time. Real, full-throated. It rolled through the room like someone had cued it on a soundboard. I didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Didn't move a muscle. That's the first thing you learn in the army. Stay calm under fire. Second thing? Memorize faces. I scanned the head table like I was marking targets. My father smiled politely. Graham looked amused, as if he didn't understand the weight of what had just been said, but he could tell it was supposed to be funny. My mother glanced down at her lap, fingers fidgeting with her napkin. Charlotte raised her glass. To family, to futures, and to finding someone who makes you feel like you're exactly where you're meant to be. To finding someone who makes you feel like you're exactly where you're meant to be. The room echoed. I lifted my glass not with champagne, just water, and tapped it gently against the table's edge. No toast. Just a sound to remind myself I was still there. When she sat down, the applause was generous. People leaned in to compliment her. A few glanced my way, none came over. The rest of the night moved on like a conveyor belt, speeches, salad, dancing. At some point, a jazz trio started playing something with more brass than taste. Couples swayed on the floor like they were auditioning for donor privileges. I stayed seated. People avoided my end of the table like I had something contagious. Maybe I did. Self-respect tends to repel the insecure. The server asked if I wanted a second course. I declined. My appetite had already been eaten alive by sarcasm. I checked my phone. 1 bar of signal, no missed calls, no texts. Not even from Mom. Classic. A woman passed by, glanced at my table, and whispered to her friend. Isn't that Charlotte's sister, the army one? The friend shrugged. Didn't even know she had a sister. That made me smile, not out of amusement, but because invisibility has advantages. By the time the cake was rolled out, I'd seen enough. I stood quietly, slid my chair in, and walked out without saying goodbye. No one noticed. And that was the point. I kept walking until the cold air slapped the heat out of my face. The Vermont night was crisp, clear, and expensive smelling. The kind of cold that didn't bite. Tate smirked. The valet offered to bring my coat. I waved him off and kept moving. My shoes crunched over decorative gravel that probably had a designer name. The jazz trio had switched to a Sinatra cover somewhere behind me, and someone was laughing like they'd paid for the punchline. I didn't have a plan. Just distance. A little space between me and the echo of my sister's voice. I didn't want to cry. I wasn't angry. Just hollow. That moment was just the final scoop, like I'd been carved out slowly over the years. There was a garden path near the west wing of the estate. Lanterns lit the walkway in soft pools of yellow. I followed it, mainly because no one else was. Halfway down the path, I sat on a bench behind a row of manicured hedges. The kind of place someone might take a call they didn't want overheard. Or maybe cry without ruining their makeup. I didn't have either problem. I stared at my hands. The faint tan lines from my watch, the small scar near my thumb from a field exercise back in Germany. Hands that had patched up field servers in the middle of the desert. Hands that had typed classified reports, secured wargame simulations, and signed off on budget lines that could make or break foreign intel alliances. But here, they were just hands. Not decorated. Not introduced. It's not even worth a seat near the family centerpiece. The memory came back sharp and fast. Christmas, 15 years ago. I had just made captain. Charlotte had made a partner at her firm 3 months earlier. Dad raised a toast that night. To Charlotte, he said, lifting his glass. The best thing the Brooks name ever produced. Mom had glanced my way like maybe she meant to say something. But she didn't. Back then, I told myself it didn't matter. That recognition was for resumes, and service was its reward. But that night, I'd sat quietly at the end of the table, carving lines into the napkin with a butter knife just to feel something. This wasn't new. Charlotte's toast wasn't a grenade, it was a well-aimed echo. I pulled my phone out and opened my texts. Nothing from Mom. Nothing from anyone. The last message was from a sergeant in my unit confirming a logistics call. At least the Army always remembered where I was. My fingers hovered over the call icon. I thought about dialing Mom, asking her if she'd heard the toast. If she'd left, but what would that even prove? I still wanted to believe she didn't mean to let it happen. I didn't want another polite lie in a soft voice. I stood, straightened my jacket, and returned to the ballroom. I didn't plan to go inside, just enough to signal I hadn't run off like some disgraced guest. I passed a few servers carrying champagne towers and one guy who looked like he only came for networking. As I reached the coat check, my mother exited a hallway near the restrooms. She spotted me immediately. "Delaney," she said, surprised. "Just getting some air," I said like I hadn't disappeared for 45 minutes. She hesitated, then smiled. "It's beautiful, isn't it? Charlotte did such a lovely job." "Sure," I said. She shifted her clutch from one hand to the other. Don't take her words too seriously, she was just being playful. Playful. I nodded. She always did have a killer sense of humor. Mom sighed and touched my arm like that might smooth it over. "Try to enjoy yourself. It's just one day." I didn't respond. Just smiled, collected my coat, and walked out into the night. Some days are short, some are long. And some are exactly long enough to remind you where you stand. I didn't drive straight to the hotel. I took a long way past the neighborhood we grew up in. It looked smaller now. Everything did. The gas station where Charlotte broke up with her first boyfriend behind the ice machine. The diner where Dad used to eat breakfast like he was conducting a board meeting over scrambled eggs. The street signs were newer and brighter, but the corners still held the same quiet ghosts. I didn't even think about it. My hands just turned the wheel toward the old house. It wasn't ours anymore. Mom and Dad had moved to a bigger place upstate after Charlotte made a partner. We needed something that reflected the family's direction, Dad said. Translation: no room for relics. Still, I parked across the street and stared at it like it might open its mouth and tell me what I was doing wrong. The porch light was off. The new owners had swapped the shutters for something more modern. The mailbox was different. But the shape of it, the way it sat on the lot, slightly crooked, like it had to fight for space, felt the same. I remembered the night I told my parents I wasn't going into law. I was 19, halfway through undergrad, and had already applied to West Point. Dad looked at me like I'd spat in his drink. Mom said, "Are you sure you're not just acting out?" Charlotte didn't say anything. She just looked at her phone and smiled like she'd won. It wasn't the rejection that stayed with me, it was the boredom. They weren't angry. They were just unimpressed. That stuck. I didn't stay long outside the old house. It just took long enough to confirm it no longer belonged to me. From there, I drove to their new place. The driveway was absurd. A curved, gated entrance with those little brick columns and a keypad. I punched in the code, still the same 4 digits from our home phone growing up, and the gate creaked open like it had a judgmental opinion. Their new house looked like it had been lifted from a magazine called Tastefully Superior. Tall windows, polished stone, no soul. It had character the way a showroom kitchen does. I parked, killed the engine, and sat there for a full minute. Inside, the lights were on. I could see silhouettes moving behind the curtains, Mom cleaning something that didn't need cleaning, Dad reading something expensive. I knocked lightly. Clara, the housekeeper who practically raised us, answered the door. Her face lit up when she saw me. "Miss Delaney," she said, hugging me like it had only been a month, not 3 years. "You still call me that?" "You still wear boots I can hear from 2 rooms away," she smiled. I stepped inside. The air smelled like lemon polish and floral candles, trying too hard to cover the fact that no one here really cooked anymore. "Your mother's in the sitting room," Clara said. "Go on in, I'll tell her." No need. I found Mom exactly where I expected, sitting upright on a cream-colored sofa, flipping through a magazine she wasn't reading. "Hi," I said. She looked up, startled. Then, smile as you do when someone knocks on your office door while you're on a deadline. You came, she said. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. She folded the magazine and set it aside. How was the reception? I sat across from her. You were there. I meant, after you left. I shrugged. Loud, glittery, disposable. She gave a tight smile. Charlotte means well. No, she means what she says. That's not the same thing. She leaned back and crossed one leg over the other. Her robe was silk, powder blue, perfectly ironed. Even at midnight, she looked ready for an editorial photo. She's proud of you, you know. I laughed. Quiet, but not kind. If that's her version of pride, I'll pass. Mom sighed. Not the dramatic kind, just tired. You've always been difficult. I know. But you've also always been brave. That stopped me for half a second. I didn't say thank you. I didn't need to. Your room's still upstairs, she said. Seriously? I never changed it. Just in case. That part almost got me. Almost. I nodded and stood up. I'll head up then. As I climbed the stairs, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Same eyes, same walk. Just a little straighter now. My old room looked exactly like I left it, walls painted navy, shelves with dusty books, the twin bed with creased covers. On the desk was a photo I hadn't seen in years. Me and Charlotte, both around 10. She held a fake tiara, and I saluted like a dork. We looked whole. I picked up the frame, wiped the dust with my sleeve, and stared at it until the edges blurred. Then I opened the back, slid the photo out, and tore it right down the middle. I kept my half. I folded the torn photo into my wallet and left the room before the walls closed. By morning, I was already 60 miles out, back on the interstate with a gas station coffee that tasted like bitter panic and regret. I wasn't in the mood for detours, not emotional or scenic. I had to be back on base by noon, and I didn't feel like explaining to anyone how a wedding turned into a psychological boot camp. The gate guard at Fort Andover barely glanced at my ID. I was waved through like I was invisible again, but in a helpful way this time. Cyber Command doesn't look like what people think. No giant touchscreen maps or glowing red lines racing across the globe. It's beige walls, humming servers, and the constant low-level anxiety of people who know how fragile modern infrastructure is. I dropped my duffel at my office and logged into my secure terminal. Within 5 minutes, I was already back in the rhythm. Taskings, updates, firewalls, funding reports. That comforting hum of government urgency is buried under 3 layers of bureaucracy. Then came the briefing email. Project Centurion update, 1,400 hours, secure room 5B. Centurion wasn't just another pet project. It was a full-scale cyber shield AI-driven, adaptive response systems for threats across national critical systems. Power grids, hospitals, military satellites. If Centurion worked, it would become the nervous system of American defense. I'd been with the program from the start. I helped draft the feasibility docs, oversaw 2 simulation phases, and even rewrote part of the contractor requirements. It was one of the few things that still felt worth the headache. I walked into the 5B conference room at 1358. Ellis was already there, coffee in hand, looking like she'd been up for 30 hours and wasn't interested in your sympathy. She nodded at me. New vendor just submitted late-stage proposal. I dropped into a seat. Who? She slid a folder across the table. Cranwell Dynamics. I didn't react. Not externally. But my spine went stiff. I opened the folder slowly. Logos, mission statements, and Defense's words are arranged like a Reum Notesum consultants. On page 3, the executive leadership, Charlotte D. Brooks, Vice President of Strategic Integration. My mouth didn't move. My fingers didn't twitch. I just kept flipping. Ellis raised an eyebrow. You know him? I know of them. She nodded like that was enough. We reviewed the presentation materials, slides, financial estimates, and risk assessments. On paper, it was solid. The kind of bid that looks good to people who don't know what they're looking at. But I did. The numbers were inflated in places that didn't need inflating. 2 subcontractors were registered in overseas jurisdictions with limited disclosure laws. Nothing illegal, just murky. Murky is where mistakes get made or hidden. After the meeting, I returned to my office, locked the door, and pulled the full proposal file off the secure server. Line by line. Page by page. When I hit page 83, I stopped. There it was again, Charlotte's name, tied to an internal oversight committee managing implementation. Strategically placed. Quiet, but with absolute control. I stared at it. She wasn't just on the board. She was in it. I opened a new folder in the review system. Labeled it CRN, D Internal Audit, Access, Me Only. Then I wrote my first note. Potential conflict of interest, pending verification. Duty doesn't wait. And neither would I. I stayed late that night, letting the office lights buzz while the base emptied. I told myself it was just curiosity, but I knew better. This wasn't about a procurement report. It was the sharp itch behind your eyes when something feels off, like a half-solved riddle or a lie half-swallowed. The internal systems at Cyber Command aren't built for impulsive browsing. I had to log a request, run a credential check, and encrypt every keystroke. All that is to open a corporate ownership tree on Cranwell Dynamics. It felt like using a tank to check your mailbox, but it was standard procedure. Their portfolio was massive defense contracting, logistics, AI modules, naval systems, and energy infrastructure. But I wasn't looking for their showpieces. I was looking for fingerprints. Quiet ones. Charlotte had always been strategic. That was her talent. She didn't charge through doors, she got others to open them for her. A few layers down, I found it. A shell company out of Delaware, Ironmark Strategies, LLC, is listed as a minority stakeholder in Cranwell's newest division, Digital Defense Automation. Just under 9%. Just enough to stay below certain disclosure thresholds, just enough to avoid triggering DoD audit protocols. And who was listed as the senior advisor to Ironmark's board? Charlotte D. Brooks. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Not shocked. Not even angry. Just impressed in a sick, tired way. She wasn't just dipping her toes in government contracting. She was waist-deep in the same sandbox I played in for a living. I pulled up the personnel database and cross-referenced her last known professional affiliations. She had never registered a conflict with any federal oversight board. That meant she either didn't think she had to or didn't think anyone would check. Either way, it was a problem. I drafted a summary, flagged the connection between Ironmark and the Centurion bid. Didn't name her outright. Not yet. Just the facts, with links and citations. I wasn't ready to drop a bomb. I wanted confirmation, pattern, proof. I grabbed a protein bar from my desk drawer and kept digging. At 2:43 a.m., buried deep in a procurement trail from 18 months prior, I found an internal memo from a Cranwell division citing legacy system insights provided by internal consultant CDSB. Not a real department name, not even a known acronym. CDSB. Charlotte Denise Sinclair Brooks. It wasn't a signature, but it was a fingerprint. I called Ellis first thing the next morning. "Are you sitting down?" I asked. "Number you want me to be?" "Probably." She paused. "Jesus. What did you find?" I gave her the short version and walked her through the ownership shell, the internal memo, and the lack of disclosure. "You think she's laundering influence into the bid?" she asked. "I think she's buried deep enough in the wiring that we won't know how far the current runs until someone gets electrocuted." Ellis let out a long breath. "You want me to escalate?" "Not yet. Let me follow the power lines a little further." "Okay," she said. "But wear gloves." By Thursday, I had mapped out everything I could get without tripping the alarm. 4 layered LLCs, 2 overseas IP transfers, and 1 suspicious partnership with a data analytics firm in Ontario. It was a house of cards dressed in business casual. That afternoon, I submitted an internal inquiry to the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Anonymous, just to be safe. But I didn't stop there. I also scheduled a meeting with procurement oversight. If Cranwell wanted to play in my sandbox, they would learn the rules the hard way. I shut the folder, leaned back, and made the call I'd been avoiding. Colonel Myers picked up on the second ring. "Ma'am? I need authorization to pull financial records on Ironmark Strategies. Full scope, quietly." There was a pause. Then, "We expecting blowback?" "Not yet," I said. "But the stakes are federal contract fraud." "Understood. You'll have it in the hour." Hanging up, I felt the first thrum of nerves in my gut. Not fear, just awareness. I was poking at a system that didn't like being touched. By noon, the preliminary access came through. Just enough to start threading the needle. Ironmark's financials weren't clean. It wasn't just the $47 million in auxiliary R&D spending with no traceable outcome. It was the pattern. Layered shell accounts, shuffled subsidiaries, blind trusts linked to offshore holding firms. The money looked like it was running laps to exhaust anyone chasing it. I'd seen better obfuscation from foreign intelligence laundries. This was calculated. And Charlotte's name appeared 3 times each, buried under layers of legal redirection but not quite hidden. She was no fool, but she'd underestimated how good we are at tracing shadows. At 2:45 p.m., I walked into the office next door, tossed a file on Captain Valdez's desk, and said, "Run this name. Cross-check with DoD contractor access points, advisory rosters, and indirect disclosures from the last 24 months. Valdez raised an eyebrow. "Anyone I know?" "My sister," I said. He blinked. "Okay. That changes the tone of this request." "Not really. Same protocol, same paper trail. Just don't leak it, and don't draw a circle around her name." He nodded and got to work. For the next 2 days, I rotated between my office, the SCIF, and the digital war room, where we ran simulations on system integrity breaches. I handled a mock Russian intrusion attempt at 3 a.m., coordinated an interagency handoff with DHS, and reviewed 3 performance audits, all while quietly building a case. Each breadcrumb fits a pattern. Each line in the ledger told the same story. Someone was playing the system. Not stealing, not laundering, but maneuvering behind the scenes to get insider access to the Centurion project under a mask of legitimacy. I wouldn't have blinked if Charlotte had just worked at a third-party defense firm. But this was a deliberate overlap. She was trying to worm her way into a corner of my world, not knowing I had the keys to the doors she was sneaking around. On Thursday morning, I walked into our classified review briefing with 5 printed reports, 3 audit flags, and a stomach full of cold coffee. Captain Valdez handed me a post-it on the way in. No registered conflict disclosures. But she's attended 2 closed-door contractor roundtables at Cranwell HQ, both listed under Ironmark's umbrella. I read the note. "And no one flagged her?" He shook his head. "Her advisory status falls just short of disclosure requirement." "Of course it does." During the meeting, I sat stone-faced through 90 minutes of operational updates, nodding like everything was fine. I didn't say a word about the file in my briefcase. Back in my office, I closed the door and stared at the wall for a long minute, not in doubt. Just calibrating. If I pushed too hard, I'd be pulled off the evaluation team. If I didn't push at all, Centurion would be compromised. The balance was razor thin. I picked up the phone and dialed the person who knew how to thread this line. "Maria," I said when she answered, "I need you to sit in on my Centurion review next week." "I thought you didn't want a babysitter." "I don't. I want a witness." She exhaled, sharp and low. "Okay. Who's the problem?" "Cranwell's top sub-bidder. Their advisory board includes someone who has no business being within 100 miles of this project." Maria didn't ask who. She trusted me. "You want to flag it?" I want to see how far they'll go before I do. There was a pause. You sure you can be objective? No, I said. That's why you'll be in the room. Maria clicked her tongue. You've got 2 days before pre-brief with procurement. You'd better have everything clean. I will. And Delaney? What? Don't get too comfortable being quiet. Sometimes the best way to catch a snake is to let it bite you first. I hung up and opened a blank memo. Not the report. Not yet. Just a single page of bullet point states, names, gaps in protocol. A map of the maze we were stepping into. No emotion. No assumptions. Let the data speak. The rest could wait. I deleted the memo, closed the laptop, and booked the earliest flight to Denver. It was technically a personal leave, but my CO didn't ask questions. Not when I flagged it as a conflict of interest disclosure and brought the Centurion file under my arm. Paperwork has a way of silencing curiosity, especially when it's stamped "confidential." At Joint Base Denver, I walked into the legal compliance office like I was reporting a gun left on a school bus. The lieutenant behind the desk raised an eyebrow when I handed over the form. Immediate family? She asked, flipping through the packet. Half-sister, I said. Company? Ironmark Strategies, under Cranwell Dynamics. She nodded slowly like the name rang a bell she didn't like. You want to recuse yourself from the evaluation team? I paused. My pen hovered over the form like a loaded weapon. That would have been the clean play. A safe move. Let someone else deal with the fallout. But something about that wedding house Charlotte smiled while she stripped the uniform of my name in front of stranger Shad stuck under my skin like glass. I'm disclosing the connection, I said. But I'm requesting to stay on the review. I won't touch the financial audit. I'll lead operational risk only. The lieutenant blinked. You're sure? If I'm not clean, I'm out. But if I am, I want to see it through. She didn't argue. Just stamped it and slid it back. It'll go to oversight. You'll hear in 48 hours. I walked out, heart pounding louder than any deployment I'd ever been on. I filed the secondary memo in my office official. Concise, cold. Then, I took the elevator to the operations floor, where Colonel Leary reviewed contractor rotation schedules. I knocked once and stepped in. Sir, I said. He looked up. Major General Brooks. You look like hell. Thanks, sir. I need to talk through something. I laid it out without embellishment. My family's connection. The shell company. My disclosure. My request to stay on. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he just nodded. You're sure you can be objective? I'm sure I won't let my personal history color a national security review. He leaned back, fingers steepled. You do realize if this goes public, if anyone finds out that a senior officer had a direct familial tie to a bidder and didn't walk away, it could torch your career. I'm not hiding it, I said. I'm managing it. He stared at me. I didn't blink. Finally, he muttered. I've seen men ruin entire departments for less noble reasons. You want the sword, you take the weight. Copy that. He signed the clearance request. You get one shot. Do it right. I stepped out into the hallway and exhaled. The review window was narrowing. 3 contractors are left in the running for Centurion. Cranwell was the most aggressive media campaigns, high-level lobbying, hell. They even had a former senator on their advisory board. The Pentagon was under pressure to award before Q4. Too many congressional committees are breathing down procurement's neck. I ran risk matrices for each bidder. No names. Just performance indicators, breach history, supply chain vetting, and vulnerability response time. Cranwell looked solid on paper. But so did Enron. What didn't add up was the missing log data from Ironmark's R&D funnel. $14 million was tagged as algorithmic defense modeling with no versioning logs or partner sandbox testing. And the Singapore trailet had Charlotte's fingerprints all over it. Her writing style is in the internal notes, her phrasing in the mission objectives. I had the receipts. Still, I didn't fire. Instead, I did what the Army taught me: build the case. Quiet, precise, no theatrics. By day, I led briefings like nothing was wrong. By night, I matched IP traces and audit trail inconsistencies. I didn't tell anyone else. Not even Maria Ellis. Not until I could prove the line between conflict and corruption. There's something hollow about suspecting your blood of playing the system you swore to protect. It doesn't feel like anger. It feels like acid. Like something slow and corrosive eating at your spine. But I wasn't here to feel. I was here to finish the job. I skipped dinner, printed the audit logs, and walked straight into the lion's den. The Cranwell Dynamics headquarters in downtown Denver looked like something ripped out of a tech billionaire's wet dream: glass panels, brushed steel, a ridiculous art installation in the lobby no one could explain, and a receptionist who looked like she had a trust fund bigger than my deployment budget. I didn't come to admire the architecture. I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, walked past rows of glass-walled offices full of people pretending to look busy, and stopped before a familiar name etched in silver. Charlotte Brooks, Senior Director, Government Relations. Classy. Still not classy enough to hide a conflict of interest. Her assistant looked up as I approached. "Do you have an appointment?" I didn't slow down. "Tell her Delaney Brooks is here, she'll want to make time." She barely buzzed in before Charlotte's door opened. My sister stood in a navy blazer, arms crossed, trying to look surprised and failing. "Delaney," she said, her voice too smooth. "This is unexpected." I walked into her office without waiting for an invitation and tossed the folder onto her glass desk. "Relax," I said. "This isn't a social call." She shut the door behind me, sighed, and sat down like she was about to start a negotiation. "You couldn't have called first? And let you rehearse a script?" "No thanks." I pulled out the first page. "Tell me why your company routed $14.2 million in undefined infrastructure optimization through a firm in Luxembourg 2 months before bidding on a DoD contract." Her face didn't change, but her knuckles went white against her coffee mug. "I don't handle the financials." "You approved the procurement notes." "I review what legal clears." "You signed it." That shut her up. She looked at me like she was weighing her options: deny, deflect, or play the victim. She went with deflect. "Why do you care? Isn't this a bit outside your lane?" "Not when I'm lead evaluator on Project Centurion." I leaned forward. "And not when the company on the shortlist has my sister's name on the executive line and numbers that don't add up." Her lips parted, stunned for a half second before the performance kicked in. "So this is about you? About proving something?" I laughed, short and sharp. "This is about ethics. National security. You know, those little things that matter more than your 6-figure bonus and Instagram engagement." She stood up, arms rigid. "You always loved playing the martyr. The uniform doesn't make you righteous, Delaney. And the boardroom doesn't make you clean, Charlotte." Her jaw clenched. "You could tank this deal. Do you know what that would mean?" "For whom, you or the country?" Her silence gave me my answer. I gathered the papers and stood up. "You still have a chance to fix this. Pull out, admit the conflict, save what's left of your credibility." She scoffed. "And let your name shine while mine burns?" I met her stare. "I'm not here to win. I'm here to do my damn job." I walked out without slamming the door, but ensured the echo followed me down the hall. Her assistant didn't even look up. Maybe she was used to executive meltdowns. Back in the elevator, I stared at my reflection in the mirror panel. Still me. Still the same tight bun, pressed uniform, eyes that hadn't blinked at a missile threat but somehow wanted to close now. At the lobby exit, I passed the same ridiculous sculpture. Abstract metal hands reaching toward nothing. For once, it felt accurate. Charlotte thought this was personal. And maybe it was. But not the way she assumed. I didn't need revenge. I needed accountability. I needed her to understand that doing the right thing wasn't optional, especially when the stakes were this high. And no one in that office knew how high they were yet. I kept walking past the glass, the lobby, and the polished lies until the sunlight hit my face and I could finally breathe. I didn't go home. I didn't go back to base. I went straight to the Pentagon liaison's office and signed the damn briefing paperwork myself. 2 days later, I was back in Denver, this time not as Charlotte's sister, not as the family disappointment, not as a plus one they'd rather uninvite. I walked into the briefing room as Lieutenant Colonel Delaney Brooks, lead evaluator for Project Centurion under the Department of Defense. The building was corporate theater at its finest, sleek glass walls, sound-absorbing carpets, and the subtle scent of money. The elevator took me to the top floor, escorted by a jittery assistant who wouldn't meet my eye for more than 2 seconds. I didn't blame her. A uniform like mine wasn't made for this building. It made people nervous, like it was telling the truth out loud. The doors to the boardroom opened, and there they were. A dozen faces were seated around a polished table, frozen when they saw me. Executives, consultants, and yes, my father, Edward Sinclair, the board chairman, and Charlotte, in her finest power suit, seated confidently near the center like she ran the place. She had no idea. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the DOD liaison beside me. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Delaney Brooks. She will lead the technical and operational review for Project Centurion today." You could feel the temperature drop 5 degrees. Charlotte's face didn't twitch at first. Her smile stayed glued on like a sticker, but her eyes flared. Edward leaned back slowly, calculating. The other execs were doing that thing where they tried to remember everything they'd ever said about me, just in case I'd heard it. I stepped forward, dropped the black folder on the table, and clicked the remote. The screen lit up with network schematics, cyber intrusion metrics, flagged expenditures, and infrastructure vulnerabilities. "This isn't just about systems," I said. "It's about trust. Project Centurion is designed to protect this nation's energy grids, health systems, and defense communication networks. Which means the people behind it must be unimpeachable. And currently, you are not." Silence. No one even pretended to clear their throat. Let's start with the Singapore expenditures. $6.8 million tagged as testing and deployment. The facility listed doesn't exist. The project lead is a fictional person. The travel receipts are for locations never visited. One of the legal advisors adjusted her glasses. "That's likely just a filing error." 3 quarters in a row? I cut in. "Either your accountants are incompetent or someone's cleaning money through a non-existent site. Neither scenario makes you eligible." Charlotte finally spoke. "With all due respect, Delaney, we weren't informed you'd be the one." "You don't get to approve who evaluates you, Charlotte," I said evenly. "And it's Lieutenant Colonel, not Delaney, not here." The air got heavier. Edward opened his mouth, then shut it again. That alone was worth the trip. I kept going, methodically outlining protocol breaches, weak encryption, fallback protocols, and the decision to subcontract part of the critical firewall system to a company currently under federal audit. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every word I said cut deeper than if I'd yelled. The kicker came when I displayed the internal memos Charlotte had signed greenlighting those exact budget allocations. She looked down at her tablet, blinking faster than necessary. "You have 48 hours to produce corrected documentation and a chain of custody report," I said. "If not, your company will be disqualified from the final bidding process. That decision is non-negotiable." Nobody moved. Not a whisper. Even the assistant in the corner stopped typing. When I closed the folder and stepped back, I didn't make eye contact with Charlotte or Edward. I didn't need to. The screen was still glowing behind me, all numbers and red lines and proof. They were watching their legacy unravel, and I didn't flinch. As I exited the room, someone finally muttered, "That's her?" Like I was some urban legend. I didn't turn around. The hallway was quiet. The only sound was my footsteps, calm and steady. Let them sit with it. I walked straight to the elevator, took the longest ride down without blinking, and texted Ellis one word: delivered. The next morning, The boardroom at Leland Strategic Solutions was packed with polished suits, muted egos, and the faint smell of five-figure coffee. The room had a quiet tension that usually precedes either a hostile takeover or a confession. I wore a full dress uniform, which wasn't required, but sometimes visual reminders do the work words can't. I entered without fanfare. Robert Callahan was already standing. He gave me a nod and gestured toward the screen behind me. "Ladies and gentlemen, Major Delaney Brooks, Department of Defense Evaluation Lead, Project Centurion." The silence snapped into focus. Eyes darted up. Charlotte was already seated at the far end, next to her boss, Daniel Kessler, CEO of Cranwell Dynamics. Her posture screamed confidence, but her jaw twitched just enough to confirm she hadn't slept well. I placed my folder on the glass table, clicked the remote, and let the first slide speak. Redacted budget lines. Shell vendor trails. Singapore expenditures that led to nothing and no one. "This is your Q3 reporting for Project Centurion," I said evenly. "You labeled $38.2 million as auxiliary technical services. Your own regional subsidiary hasn't had a functioning network since last fiscal year." Daniel shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I continued. "Your internal audit trail was manually overwritten. 6 users. All back-end access. No justification filed. When I cross-referenced logins with employee schedules, one of the user accounts was tied to a terminated contractor, someone who, as of 2 weeks ago, was working under a fake badge." Charlotte's pen froze mid-scribble. "We traced that badge request to Cranwell's West Division. Issued under your name," I added, looking directly at her. Her face went pale. Daniel turned to her slowly, like a man discovering fire burns. "Miss Brooks," he said, "is this accurate?" "I don't," Charlotte started. "I never approved that. I've never even seen." I cut her off. "You submitted the quarterly summary, signed it, and sent it to the DoD office. Your credentials verified the badge. If it wasn't you, your division's compromised. If it was, we have a much bigger issue." She looked at me like she'd swallowed a brick. Daniel leaned back and folded his arms, letting her squirm. I clicked again. The following slide was a snapshot, a screenshot from an internal chat room dated 2 months back. Charlotte's initials were on a message instructing someone to clean the numbers before it hits external audit. She knew she was done. Daniel turned to me. "What happens now?" "You'll receive a compliance review order today. You can respond with corrections and internal documentation within 72 hours. If your team can't explain the discrepancies, Project Centurion will be suspended, and a federal audit will begin. You may also be disqualified from future defense contracts pending review." No drama. Just procedure. Which made it hit harder. Charlotte didn't speak. For once, her mouth had no clever retort, no slick excuse. She was staring at the screen like it was showing her obituary. Robert stood. "We appreciate your transparency, Major Brooks. I believe that concludes our review." I nodded, closed my folder, and turned to leave. Halfway to the door, Daniel's voice stopped me. "Major Brooks." I turned. "Yes, sir?" He stood slowly. "You're the only reason we're even getting a chance to respond instead of being torched in the press. I respect how you handled this." His tone wasn't gratitude, it was recognition. I held his gaze. "My job isn't to ruin reputations," I said. "It's to protect national infrastructure. If that overlaps with someone's bad decisions, that's not my fault." He nodded. When I stepped outside, the air felt clearer. Not poetic clear, just factual. Something rotting had finally been dragged out of the sun and dropped on the table for everyone to see. The DoD response team pulled up by the curb when I reached the sidewalk. Black SUVs, federal plates, and that grim efficiency of people with zero interest in pleasantries. I didn't wait to greet them. I'd already done my job. I crossed the plaza and kept walking. Past the manicured landscaping, the fountain shaped like a shield, and the security desk where the receptionist pretended not to recognize me from 2 days ago. I didn't need a victory lap. Behind me, the building loomed tall and sleek, filled with people who still didn't know how close they'd come to losing everything over ego and shortcuts. And somewhere in the echo of all that glass and marble, I hoped Charlotte was finally learning what it felt like to be dismissed not by accident, but by design. I didn't look back, I just kept walking until the silence behind me felt earned. That night, I flew back to Fort Andover. The military transport was cold, quiet, and full of enlisted kids half my age, trying not to fall asleep sitting upright. I didn't talk. I didn't need to. The silence was a relief. No briefings, backpedaling executives, or glass buildings full of corporate rot. Just engine noise and the unshakable stillness that comes after a decision you don't regret. When I got back to base, my inbox was full. Official memos. Internal reviews. One very polite, "We appreciate your cooperation" email from the Office of Defense Contracts. But what caught my eye was the one with no subject line. Just a name in the sender field, Charlotte Brooks. I stared at it for a full minute before opening it. One sentence. Are you proud of what you've done? No greeting. No punctuation at the end. Just a question that didn't feel like a question. I didn't respond. I didn't even delete it. I left it sitting there, unread in spirit if not in form. Some messages don't deserve a reply, not because you're avoiding them, but because they were never meant to be answered. By the following week, the Centurion bid had officially been reopened. Cranwell Dynamics was pulled from the shortlist. Charlotte's name was removed from their leadership page. Press releases cited a strategic restructuring. It was all spotless. Very diplomatic. Corporate damage control at its most sterile. The real fallout came quietly. My father, Edward Sinclair, resigned from the board. No announcement. Just a 2-line blurb in the Denver Business Journal that no one outside the industry noticed. He didn't call, no message, no email. But I heard from an old friend at West Point that his country club pulled his honorary plaque. That part made me laugh. Not out of spite, just at the irony. He'd built his whole identity on status, decorum, and perception. And I'd quietly dismantled it with nothing more than a laser pointer and a legal binder. Ellis found me in the operations bay later that week. She tossed a bottle of Coke on my desk like a medal. You tanked a multi-million-dollar contract and still kept your job. That's impressive. I popped the cap. Give it time. Charlotte call you? She emailed. You answer? Nope. She sat down. Want to talk about it? I shrugged. She asked if I was proud. That's not a conversation, it's bait. Ellis leaned back. You are proud though, right? I took a sip. I'm relieved. There's a difference. She nodded, not pressing further. That's why I liked her. She knew when to shut up and when to sit still. In the Army, that's a rare talent. The next call came 3 days later. Unknown number. Colorado area code. I let it ring, thinking it would go to voicemail. It didn't. Delaney? The voice cracked like it hadn't spoken in days. Charlotte. I didn't say anything. I didn't think you'd actually do it. Still, I said nothing. I mean, I figured you'd come at me hard, maybe make noise, but this? You burned everything. Finally, I spoke. I didn't burn it. You lit the match. I just turned on the lights. There was a pause, the kind of pause that feels heavier than yelling. You ruined our family. I almost laughed. Almost. Charlotte, our family was a press release waiting to collapse. You just didn't like that someone told the truth before you could control the headline. I lost everything. No, I said, keeping my voice flat. You lost what you lied to get. That's not the same. She didn't argue. Maybe because she knew she couldn't. Maybe because she'd finally run out of scripts. I never hated you, you know, she said softly. I just never understood you. That's because you never tried. Click. I ended the call without another word. Not out of cruelty, just clarity. Sometimes, silence is the only punctuation that fits. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just sat in my office, boots on the desk, watching the sun stretch over the tarmac like it was pulling the whole base forward. Family doesn't always break loudly. Sometimes it cracks in whispers and unfinished sentences. And sometimes it ends precisely where it was always meant to. I powered off my phone, slid it into the desk drawer, and locked it without hesitation. The world outside could wait. None of the inbox, the calls, the family, if it still qualified as that, mattered for the moment. All that mattered was that I had done my job. Fully. Finally. I pulled on my jacket and stepped outside the operations building. The air was crisp and sharp with that mix of jet fuel and pine that somehow only exists on bases like this one. I walked the perimeter without speaking to anyone. A few soldiers passed me with half salutes, unsure whether to interrupt. They didn't. Good instinct. Back in my quarters, I changed out of uniform. Not into civvies, into something in between. Joggers, a sweatshirt neutral, unbranded. It felt strange, like putting the skin back on after weeks in armor. The kind of strange that doesn't hurt, just reminds you what vulnerability feels like. I poured myself a glass of water, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the picture on my dresser. It was a photo from my first deployment, me and the unit, young, tired, sunburnt, and grinning like idiots. No medals, no ranks. Just dirt, sweat, and trust. I'd kept it all these years, not because it was sentimental, but because it reminded me why I kept showing up. Not for applause. Not for revenge. But because someone had to. My sister never understood that. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe you can't unless you've sat in a command tent with people who would follow your voice into a minefield. Maybe you have to lose someone in a firefight to understand what integrity costs and why it's always worth it. Later that afternoon, I got the final report. Cranwell Dynamics, officially disqualified. Ironmark Strategies, under federal investigation. Charlotte Brooks was terminated from her role, under review for legal misconduct, and voluntarily resigned from all boards immediately. No court dates. No mugshots. Just a quiet end behind closed doors. That's how reputations die in high places. Not with sirens. With signatures. I signed my portion of the Centurion post-review log. Ellis walked in right as I was sealing the envelope. "You good?" she asked, leaning in the doorway with a protein bar half-eaten. "Yeah. You want to grab a drink?" I shook my head. "Think I'll pass tonight." She raised an eyebrow. "You always pass." I smiled. "Not always. Just when it's enough." She tossed the protein bar on my desk and left. No lecture, no pep talk. That's why I trusted her. A few days later, I got invited to another wedding, this time a friend from West Point. I didn't RSVP. Not because I was bitter. I didn't need a reminder of what fake smiles in floral dresses felt like. Instead, I took a weekend trip to Arizona. Quiet hiking, no cell reception, no politics. Just rocks, sky, and the occasional hawk that circled like it was keeping watch. That's the kind of silence I liked. Not avoidance presence. When I got back, a manila envelope was waiting on my desk. No note, no return address. Inside was a photo. A copy of that wedding, where Charlotte called me a lowly soldier. Only this time, the frame was cracked. Whoever sent it had scribbled one line on the back in red pen. Funny how truth never needed a microphone. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I just slipped it into a drawer and closed it. You don't need to frame justice. It hangs itself. Weeks passed. Then months. I took on a new project. Trained a younger officer who reminded me of myself before life got complicated. Quiet. Blunt. Too smart to play dumb. Too stubborn to care if people liked her. I liked her instantly. One afternoon, she asked me, "Do you ever think about walking away from all this?" I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said. "Because even if I did, it wouldn't walk away from me." She nodded as she understood. Maybe she did. I never heard from Charlotte again. No second email. No apology, no public statements, just silence. The good kind, The earned kind. People think revenge is loud. Explosions, public takedowns, viral clips. But the real kind, the kind that lasts, it's quiet. It's when the person who called you just a soldier has to read your name on a federal memo and realize they'll never outrun it. And you? You don't need to explain anything to anyone. Because the truth doesn't need applause. It just needs a backbone. Sometimes, the hardest part isn't confronting them, it's accepting they'll never say sorry. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't wait for closure. It doesn't matter if they understand or regret it. It just sits there, solid as concrete, while the rest of the world keeps moving. And when the dust finally settles, you're still standing not because you shouted, won, or refused to sit down. So, no, I didn't need an apology. I had the facts. I had the uniform. And I had my name still intact, still mine. If you're into real-life revenge stories and family drama that cuts deep, hit that subscribe button. We've got more where this came from, and trust me, the truth always makes the best plot twist.